Hey folks, before we get into this week's episode of Transcending Comics, I wanted to make a quick dedication to a friend I lost while I was editing this interview. Her name was Liara Kaylee Tsai, and she was an incredibly talented DJ, one of the most spiritual people I've ever met, and a pillar of the trans community for both Iowa City and Minneapolis. Liara was one of the first musicians that let me feature her music on the early episodes of the show, and I can honestly say that the nights I saw her perform were some of the most uplifting and inspiring moments of my first 2 years of transition. In memory of Liara, we'll be using her music for this week's intro and outro. This episode is of course also dedicated to Rachel Pollack, who, as you'll soon hear, was an incredibly influential trans creator and one of the most notable trans voices in the realm of tarot and spiritualism. It's been impossible not to think of Liara while working on this episode, which has made the editing process an incredibly emotional experience. As hard as this has all been, it's also inspired me to look even further into Rachel's work. Learning about Rachel's own personal brand of spiritualism has helped me feel closer to the friends I've lost over the last 2 weeks that helped inspire my interest in spiritualism in the first place. While this week's episode largely focuses on Rachel's career in the comic book industry, I'd love to do an episode in the future exploring her more spiritual work. If anyone listening has any memories or personal experiences with Rachel that you'd like to share, feel free to send them my way. You can email me at transcendingcomics@gmail.com or find me on Instagram and Blue Sky as Tommy Trimbath. I appreciate you taking a moment to remember Liara with me. Now, on to this week's episode celebrating the remarkable contributions of Rachel Pollack to the world of comics and beyond. Welcome to Transcending Comics, a podcast dedicated to trans representation in comic books, manga, and webtoons, both on panel and behind the scenes. I'm your host, Tommy, and today we're going to be taking a look at the creative works of one of the most prolific trans comic book writers of all time, Rachel Pollack. Rachel was the first openly transgender writer to work in mainstream comics, as well as the creator of Coagula from the Doom Patrol, the first transgender superhero in the DC universe. She was also an award-winning sci-fi and fantasy novelist with acclaimed books like Unquenchable Fire, Godmother Night, and Temporary Agency. Rachel is even more well-known, however, for her work as a feminist activist and as a spiritual figure. She created the Shining Tribe Tarot deck and wrote both 78 Degrees of Wisdom and A Walk Through the Forest of Souls, both of which are considered foundational texts in modern tarot interpretations. Her work inspires many to this day, and she played a major role in helping to create a more welcoming space for transgender individuals in the realm of comic books, feminism, and spiritualism. Joining me today to help explore Rachel's work is writer and editor Joe Corallo. Joe contributed an original story to DC Pride, A Celebration of Rachel Pollack, in which he brought her character of Coagula back to the DC universe. He also worked with Rachel as a co-writer on their Comixology original series, The Never-Ending Party, and he's been a part of many other notable comics, working as an editor on Kim and Kim, Mine, and the upcoming Crisis on Our Only Earth anthology, and as a writer on books like Beckstar, She Said Destroy, and King Arthur and the Knights of Justice. No further ado, I'd like to welcome to the show, Joe Corallo.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
So glad you could join us. Mm-hmm. So before we begin, everything I've said about Rachel so far is what I've been able to find in my research online as a stranger, but as someone who knew her personally and had a working relationship with her, what else should our audience know about Rachel before we get into this conversation?
There were few things in history and art history and sociology and things like that that Rachel either didn't know or didn't have an interest in finding out about. She loved to travel. She loved understanding different cultures. I think one thing that's interesting, and I was having this discussion with Richard Case, who illustrated Doom Patrol, mostly for Grant, but started, the first arc of Rachel's as well, and got the chance to work with Rachel for a little bit there. Yeah, I described it to him this way, and he agreed that Grant's sort of way of thinking, there was a lot of anarchy and chaos to it. Of I'm going to throw a bunch of pieces out there and then I'm going to put them together like a jigsaw and make the story work. Like he would, come up with things. He would do these just like chaotic things of like
Hmm.
typing things out and then figuring, like they could type up gibberish and put it all together and then be like, well, what does this mean? And then figure it out. Whereas the way Rachel would do so many things, like every little bit you would talk about with Rachel would be like, oh, well, this was from this civilization. This was, a ritual done here. And this is from the ancient texts here. And this is from this religion. And she could like, there was meaning and intent in every aspect of her work, whether it was her novels, tarot, her comics like Doom Patrol. There was always intention. There was always meaning. And I know, especially at the time when Doom Patrol was coming out, there was a segment of the population who was like, "What is this? This seems like gibberish." Or like, "Oh, this is a bunch of nonsense." And it's like, no, she could explain every little bit of everything in all of that through her work.
So tell us a bit about how you first came across Rachel's work and how you two got into contact with each other eventually from there.
So what ended up happening was, I was a big fan of Grant's Doom Patrol run. And, I did some research and stuff after, and I knew, it kept going, but it was never collected. And at the time, this is, like, I don't know, like probably 2014. Not a lot of people were really talking about it. Or, you could find like maybe some articles here and there, but nothing, it wasn't really a part of the conversation. And I'm friends with Martha Thomas's, who worked at DC at the same time that Rachel was there and was a friend of Rachel's as well. And I was like, so, and Martha's also friends with Grant. And I was like, so, I love the Doom Patrol. And and this is part of it too. Martha owns the last page of Grant's Doom Patrol run,
Mm.
which is, incredible. And so I was like, she's a Doom Patrol fan. I was like, so, people don't talk enough about, Rachel's run. Like, is that something I should read? She was like, absolutely, you should read it. It's good. So I was like, okay. So a mixture of back issue bin diving and eBay, I was able to cobble together the run over time. I read the whole thing and I loved it so much that I found Rachel's website. She had her email address and I emailed her. I emailed her. The subject line was a new fan. And, I wrote out just a nice thing about, how much I loved it, how important it was. And within 20 minutes, she emailed me back. And, I've never done this before on any podcast, but let me see. I will just get her initial response and share it, because why not?
Oh, I'd love that.
Yeah.
I've seen that website of hers. It's still even up, like how she uses a Sephiroth or like Tree of Life as the navigation of the site. It's real clever, but also like real classic internet.
Absolutely. So, oh my God, it was exactly 20 minutes. So it was August 10th, 2015 at 5:37 p.m. Eastern when I wrote, and it was, I wrote her, good afternoon, Miss Pollack. I've been a rather big fan of Doom Patrol for some years now. And, I go into a bunch of stuff and then, I end with, I'm looking forward to delving into your prose work as well after getting through this. Thank you for putting out such high quality work, and I hope all is well. Regards from a new fan, Joe. At 5:57 p.m., so exactly 20 minutes later.
Oh,
Thank you so much, Joe. This really makes my day. Say hello to Martha for me next time you speak to her. Thanks again, Rachel. And then, we started going back and forth and, got to be friends. She lived at the time in, Rhinebeck, and I'm on Long Island. So about 2.5 hours away. I would take the Amtrak up to visit her, and she would pick me up in her car. We would hang out in Rhinebeck, and sometimes when she was healthy enough, she would come down to Manhattan. Martha Thomas's would have her Hanukkah donut party every year, and Rachel was able to come to a few of those, which was an opportunity for her to. She got to meet Max Saggio at those parties. She got to meet a bunch of other new fans, and she got to see some old acquaintances like Stuart
hmm.
Moore, who edited Time Breakers. and who also wrote the intro to the DC Pride Celebration of Rachel Pollack. She got the opportunity to see, not just Martha, but like Heidi McDonald and some other people she had gotten to know over the years through her work at DC. So it really did mean a lot. I was able to sort of get her back into comics over time. We would, I was able to get her into this Mine anthology to benefit Planned Parenthood. And I paired her with Fyodor Pavlov, who is, a trans comic artist and tarot artist himself. So that was a lot of fun. I've known Fyodor for years, and it was a very cool story, very deep, seeped in a Greek mythology. But yeah, just think about like going to a Forbidden Planet, like with Rachel, like just the two of us, like going in and just like buying the new comics like off the rack and stuff like that. That was a lot of fun. There was a time we did that, and Martha joined us, and we got Thai food at I think it was Spice, which was like a couple of blocks from Forbidden Planet. All these sort of things like that. But yeah, it was just incredible getting to go to multiple shops with her over the years, getting to also get her into the Deadbeats anthology, which she did in 2019, which was a reunion of, it was her, Richard Case, and John Workman, who had lettered her whole run, as well as Grant's, and who we also got rather to letter the 10-pager for the Celebration of Rachel Pollack one shot. And I got to see John at Heroes Con this past weekend. And he was very sweet. He had said that, he thought Rachel would have loved it. It was very, very kind of him. But yeah, I mean, we got to be good friends. We ended up I had come up with the Never Ending Party idea specifically to kind of trick Rachel into writing more comics. And part of that too, which was a lot of fun for me, is I didn't initially have the character of Mindy Morrow, which I love that name, but do tarot. I originally had her doing astrology just to get it so Rachel would be like, could Mindy do tarot instead? I just wanted Rachel to have to like tell me like, yeah, we're doing tarot. Like I just
Machiavellian planning right there. I love it.
But no, it was and that was a blast. I mean, that was the way we would write that would be we would have a phone conversation. I would take notes, and then I would just split up the scenes, with me and Rachel. We would I'd email over the notes and stuff, and it would be like, she would take these scenes and then I would take the rest. And it worked out to more or less being an even split every issue. And after the first issue, I think after the first, or it might have been after the second, I know she handled the majority of the endings. So I'm thinking it was definitely 3 through 5, but it might have been 2 through 5. I'd have to go back to the notes and double check. But that was a lot of fun because I am of an age. I'm 39. So when I was in elementary school and offline before we started recording, I was talking about how I was a pretty gay kid, but so there were times I clearly remember like being homesick from school, or quote unquote sick from school in like 3rd grade. So this would be like, like 93, and watching like Geraldo Rivera's talk show or Phil Donahue when like the Club Kids would be on. And like, that was my first experience with like RuPaul and the Club Kids and all of that, which was, a big part of the inspiration for the book.
Yeah. I see that almost directly referenced in there with the characters in the 80s. Love
so, I when I was talking about it with, Rachel, a lot of the mythology and stuff like that, she was like, I can handle that. And then like, the Club Kid elements and some of this stuff, she's like, I'm not as well versed in. So I was like, I got you on that. Don't worry. And, it was definitely, I'm trying to think, it would have been her idea to make it Dionysus and use the Maenads. And then, I had the like, I had not Geraldo Rivera in that comic. And that was fun, putting all that together. And I watched, while we were putting it together, I not only rewatched a bunch on YouTube of like the old like Geraldo Rivera Club Kid episodes, I also made it a point to, read the book, Party Monster was originally Disco Bloodbath, but I was like, let me buy
Hmm.
this, book. I had been meaning to read it because I'd seen the movie Party Monster, but I never read the book. So, I just wanted to have as much of that just in my mind when we were writing it.
On Party Monster and yeah, Rachel kind of taking over the mythology, like I had noticed that Dionysus had like a very androgynous presentation
Yeah.
through the book. And I know in some of Rachel's more spiritual writing, like I think The Body of the Goddess, like she had kind of discussed Dionysus as a transmasculine figure of sorts. So I was curious if that like was playing an intentional role in the mythology of the Neverending Party, or if that was more artist interpretation
Definitely
there.
some of that was definitely Rachel. Ava definitely added elements to it. I think it was Rachel who suggested that Dionysus should be, just taller than everyone because throughout it he's like at
Hmm.
least a head taller than everyone through the story. But yeah, like supposed to be, androgynous throughout and Ava, I think up to that point, that was like the best work I'd seen from her. I'd worked with her on Kim and Kim previously, and just like the costume designs and everything, I absolutely loved them. There's a scene, I don't want to get into spoilers necessarily, just in case people haven't read it yet, but there's a bit where someone meets an unfortunate end. Their head washes up on Staten Island. And that's a reference to a Club Kid angel who had been killed and his body had washed up on Staten Island.
Wow.
So, I wanted to put as many references to all these things as I could in there.
Now, I had noticed that in like some of the very final pages of that miniseries, we see COVID come into play into the world
Yeah.
of the comic. Did COVID impact the writing of that book or its release? That kind of took me by surprise. Like I didn't expect it to be a COVID book until
Yeah.
there it was.
It didn't impact the release as much because the initial release was digital in the way Comixology worked. I think for the most part still does is it's about a year before the trade comes out. But, it slowed down production for sure.
Mm.
We were, I was hoping the book would come out sooner, but, it's fine. That happens. Like there were, people would get sick, things would happen. But, that was some of the more political satire commentary, especially like that stuff towards the end was really, stuff Rachel wanted to include in the book. We would talk about it on the phone because not that you don't necessarily want to talk about these things in a book, but you want to have that discussion of like, how's this going to age? Are people even going to get this like X amount of years from now? I think unfortunately we're all scarred for the rest of our lives. So, so
Mm.
yes, we'll all get it. But but yeah, that was I think that sort of stuff might as well, like don't it's not a huge part of the book, but like and that's kind of where we came down on it. Like, let's not make the book like about that, but let's also not pretend like it's not happening. And that's kind of where we fell on that.
I thought it made for a great twist
Mhm.
toward the end. Like, try to avoid spoilers
Yeah.
best I can, but like going from this party going too hard to that like complete lack of any party culture and people being like, "Oh God, please come
Yeah.
back!" Like that was a great way to tie a nice bow on it.
Yeah, no,
Surprisingly,
I mean, she handled the ending of it like phenomenally. Basically, she had this ending, and then I teed up how we get to that point. Again, like I'm trying to avoid spoilers, but I'm like the confrontation, the club, like I handled that, and then all the aftermath was Rachel, and I knew there were certain plot points she wanted to hit, so I had to be like, okay, I have to tee those up. So I was like, okay, here we go.
you mentioned kind of teeing up Rachel to bring
Yeah.
tarot to the book, and I know that like Neil Gaiman and other writers have talked about doing tarot
Yeah.
readings with Rachel or consulting her for
Hmm.
tarot in their books, and I'm curious what kind of role that played in both your relationship as friends and like as
Mhm.
co-writers. Like, did she do readings around Neverending Party or any of your other works
I
or
mean,
events?
she would do readings for herself from time to time, but you know, it wasn't necessarily discussed. I think some of that stuff was like personal or just things she would do on her own. But and this is maybe it's a regret. I don't know. It's hard to say a regret, but and I've talked about this with Zoe, her widow, of because Zoe's asked me not that long ago, like, did Rachel ever do a reading for you? And I was like, I never like, it's not that I didn't want one from Rachel, but it was like I felt like doing that would have I'm like, I don't know. I didn't want to be like that friend who's like, because I was like, I want to ask, and then like she wanted to do it, and then it was like, oh, I want to like pay you, and then like, oh, don't like I was just like,
Hmm.
oh, I want to take
Yeah.
advantage of like the friendship. And Zoe was sort of more or less like, well, that was stupid. You should have just done it. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. Which is funny because I personally have gotten readings from like friends of mine and stuff like that. Like I
Hmm.
know plenty of people that do tarot, and like that's for me was fine. But like when it was for Rachel, I was like, well, I don't want to put Rachel on the spot. Which is also funny because Rachel was a big proponent of just honoring the question asked. And I know that there are, people in tarot, and I'm not saying it's wrong or anything like that, but who, if they think maybe it's a poorly worded question, or they think that maybe there's a better question or something else that might make that sort of suggestion. But Rachel was very adamant about like you honor the question asked and you answer it with tarot to the best of your ability. That's what you're there to do. I mean, I don't think that stops anyone, including myself, from being like, oh, well,
Hmm.
I know that's what she's going to do. But I mean, she'll still think like, I don't know why he's asking me that, but sure, So,
Hmm.
but it's just more of a human nature thing of like, I know you're not going to judge me.
Hmm.
It's like you have Rachel Pollack, like, but she also has no real ego. Like, was never like, I've never heard a story from anyone or never experienced anything where it was like, Rachel Pollack was, throwing her weight around something or like, but like that just wasn't a thing. She was very approachable. So, you're right. Zoe, it was stupid.
Yeah, I'm not much of a tarot person myself, but I do own a single deck, and I was like, all right, I feel like it's just on brand if I do a poll like right before this interview, and two cards fell out while I was shuffling, so I decided to just go with
Sure.
those, and it was the Magician and the
Huh.
Lovers, which are both kind of like decision
Yeah.
focused cards. And I was like, I still am not totally sure how to interpret that in relation to the interview, but like I have been thinking about how I want to commemorate Rachel on the podcast as like, this being the first trans comic book podcast and like owing so much of like what I research and what I do
Yeah.
to her work. So yeah, I think kind of deciding like I think I'm going to do more than one episode about this. So like you and I can talk about the creative side of her and her career, and then I can talk to others that are more familiar with her tarot work because I think that was really the thing I was most impressed by as I was looking into this was just how small of a blip her comics work was in comparison to everything else she accomplished in her life.
And she still did a decent amount. I mean, that's I believe what is it? Her Doom Patrol runs, I think, the third longest because it's
Hmm.
you have the Silver Age run, you have Grant's run and hers, but I'm pretty sure she ended up writing more than Gerard. I think she wrote about I think she might have done more than yeah, I think she did more than Keith Giffen as well, because it's not just the 24 issues, there's also the 8-page story from Vertigo Jams and the annual. So that like
Hmm.
edges it over on some of the ones that make it close to like the 2-year mark.
I think I'm almost a little more impressed on how many small runs we've been had on Doom Patrol compared to those first two or
Yeah.
three. Like, yeah, I guess they have all mostly been like maxi series in hindsight.
Which I'd love to see more with Doom Patrol. I think it's such a fantastic book. And, clearly, I mean, Rachel wanted to do it because she loved Grant's run. I think that's also really important is, because I could see someone, especially now, you do tend to see a narrative. And this isn't to say that the people getting the jobs aren't big comic book fans, because I've talked to a bunch of them and they are. But the way that like sites and things tend to report it is like YA author taking over, X-Men, or movie or TV
Hmm.
writer taking over Moon Knight, or whatever it is. And it loses sight of the fact that the person is also a comics fan, and Rachel's very much a comics fan from a very young age. She loved Uncle Scrooge and all the Duck comics, Huey, Dewey, Louie, and Donald Duck and all that. She was a big fan. She loved Carl Barks in particular, like a lot of people did. But as a kid, she was like, it's the good Duck artist. But later on, like putting it together,
Hmm.
it was Carl Barks. And when she was in hospice in her home, she even had Huey, Dewey, and Louie at her bedside, like a printout of that.
Hmm.
She loved all sorts of comics. We talked when she was in the rehab facility, and I visited her in September of 2022. We were talking about like Golden Age Archie comics. We talked about that. We talked about Gene Colan. She was a big Gene Colan fan. In addition to like Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, but like, Gene Colan was another one, she really loved. And I'm a big Gene Colan fan too. That like the 70s, like Doctor Strange comics and stuff like that. It's fantastic. The work he did on that.
Yeah.
Daredevil. I mean, he did a lot of stuff, but I love Gene Colan on Batman as well. I think it's really great. But Rachel loved comics so much when she like initially was looking for like before she started teaching, she had applied to be a writer at Marvel as like an out trans woman in the early 70s, and she got rejected. I have no idea if it had anything to do if she was trans, because I it wouldn't have been something she would put on there. She would have just been rejected in the 70s
Hmm.
for being a woman, so it wouldn't matter. But
Yeah.
so, and she had like she had told this story about teaching her college courses, and one of them asked her like, like what made you want to like teach these classes? Like what made you want to be a teacher? And she responded with, well, I applied to be a writer at Marvel and they turned me down. And like the class was just like lost it. Like they were just like, it's amazing. But I also think, especially for your listeners and you and a lot of other people, that yes, she was an out trans woman in the early 70s who was teaching classes in college, and it wasn't an issue. This was
Huh.
not a thing that like she never discussed, or her friends either, of there being anything where it was like, she lost her job for being, trans, or something like that. So yeah, I mean, that's another thing too. She came out, it was 1971. There were times that, she talked about where some people would just assume that, she was at Stonewall, and she would have to be like, no, 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 I was not there. But, which is funny, but another big person in queer comics space, Howard Cruz, who we also lost, who was one of the, if not the first out gay man in comics in the 70s. He actually was at Stonewall, but like he wasn't there for the riot. He had like dropped acid, got on the subway, and was going to Stonewall. And then when he was walking up, the riot was already like going. And it took him a minute, because he was like, is this like actually happening? Or and no joke, this
Hmm.
is Howard actually told me once. He was like, Stonewall was my favorite gay bar in Manhattan before the riots.
On that note of acid, one of a number of things that like it really resonated with in Rachel's experience in doing my research was finding out that she also was able to piece together that she herself was trans on an acid trip, which is exactly what happened to me. And I can see some psychedelic influences or like elements of that kind of awakening experience in some of her writing, but I'm curious if that's something you and her ever talked about, of like what exactly she experienced on that trip or how that's maybe inspired her writing
We
over the
never
years.
talked specifically about that trip, but she was always very open about that sort of stuff and other cultures and how they would also like different cultures having their sort of experiences with psychedelics as well. And she again, like, she was just a fountain of information, but on that exact note too, which I think is fascinating. Like, there's this thing about Rachel. It's not that she was naive, because she certainly was not naive, but it was this childlike innocence she had, where she had such a loving family when she was growing up. And her
Mm,
parents were Orthodox, and she was supported. It wasn't any sort of issue. She didn't know that other, like, trans people that were coming out, like, that had, like, the some really horrible stories. It wasn't something that, like, had, like, crossed her mind initially, because she just like, she had this wonderful experience. I mean, obviously, she was young at the time, and you'll learn quickly, but it was like just this, like, because at her core, Rachel just always, like, believed in the best in people, and she
mm,
she always had this, like, positive outlook on things. And I mean, she she was able to, she's inspiring in a lot of ways, and I think this is something for a lot of people to think about and consider too. Is she was, like, aware of what was going on in the world, like, right up to the end, and she was informed. She had been more of an activist in the past, and obviously health and different things, she wasn't, like, out there in the same way, but she knew what was going on. She knew the problems. She had opinions that are probably not all that unlike me or you or most of the people that would be listening to this, but she's still, like, that never stopped anything. That was never, we never, like, we would have discussions on politics and talk about all sorts of things and what was going on. And even when I visited her in the rehab facility, it was, I believe, the day that we got Steve Bannon walking in handcuffs and having to do that perp walk. So, like, talking about that sort of thing. It was either then or, like, after that. And I called about, but it was, like, right around them. And, was very aware of all these things that were going on, but it felt like it never even crossed her mind to let the world drag her down. Like, it wasn't, like, an option. It was just, like, well,
mm,
why? You just keep going. And like, she never expressed any negativity. Like, she never expressed any general negativity about the world around her or the state of the world. Like, we'd talk about everything, but she always had this, there was this sort of feeling of, like, optimism overall, that things, would eventually, it'll eventually, get there. You just keep doing the work. And why I think this is also important for people to keep in mind is she was there during times like the whole Gay Liberation Front, in London. For people that don't know, when she was active there, 1972, they were really supportive. And then she had left to go back to the States for a little bit. I believe it was to come out to her parents, do some other things, and came back. And something had happened in that network that just sort of, like, poisoned the well. And there was division, and there were people that were working within there that, who were gay, lesbian, bi, etc., that were suddenly not open or welcome to trans people and the trans cause. Sound familiar, anybody? But
mm.
and this was, again, in the 70s. Like, they think there is this cyclical kind of nature to it. And and she experienced that. And she still, she dealt with that personally, being involved in an organization, and still moved on, and was able to have an overall positive attitude about things. And I feel like, Rachel, more than a lot of people, had reason not to be, because she saw that
Mhm.
happen over and over again. When she was marching in the early 90s in Manhattan for Pride, the organizers didn't want any trans people openly walking as trans people supporting trans rights. They didn't want that focus. And her and a small group of other, out trans people were like, we're going to anyway. So either you freak out and call the cops and have us arrested in public for marching, or you let us do it. And they let him do it. And more people joined them. It was like 10 or so people at first, holding a banner and walking. So again, this is someone who multiple times over decades, be involved in an organization, they become maybe less interested or openly hostile towards the trans experience and trans rights, and then, go somewhere else, same thing happens, and she would push forward, and it's really remarkable. So, I think she is someone to look to for a lot of that at times when, it might seem hard.
As a little footnote on that, I'd just like to throw out for listeners out there that Extra Magazine had a great little expose on the life of Rachel that goes into a lot of that activism and that experience of like leaving and coming back to a community that was far less accepting of her on her return. Was Jude Allison S. Doyle that wrote that. So if anyone wants to have like a good quick read with a nice overview of the various facets of Rachel's life, that's like a great starting place to get a big picture of what kind of accomplishments you can find in
No,
her life.
absolutely.
But on that sense of optimism, I think that's something that's really helped her work stand out as described by many other writers like yourself, Neil Gaiman, that like it was just so far ahead of
Yeah.
its time. Like reading Coagula's first appearance, The Laughing Game now, like it has aged perfectly. Like there's nothing I see in that reading it as a trans woman now that makes me wince. And knowing that this was the 90s
Yep.
of all times when everyone else is responding to the crying game by making even more transphobic references. Meanwhile, like I'm assuming calling this story The Laughing Game was also a play on that. And it's like the perfect response to just the general like tone and dialogue of trans people at that time. And like that optimism shows throughout her work that I've read so far in the community I see her queer characters
Yeah.
having. Like I never feel like I'm reading about characters that are questioning whether or not it's worth it to be
Mhm.
trans, to be lesbian. Like a friend just asked me today about like what I look for in good queer representation, and I think that's one of the key elements of like finding that queer joy in
Yeah.
community, and just like seeing these amazing depictions of trans culture or like lesbian culture in Godmother Night that still resonate and just feel so real as someone experiencing modern queer culture. I'm like this is what it looks like. Yeah, I can't believe anyone was writing so accurately about this 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, no, it is wild. And I think some of it also speaks to when you're saying that, and this is a slight tangent, I'd love to, sort of get your opinion on this as well. I guess I'm like,
Of course.
now I'm interviewing you kind of. But one thing, and I've talked to other queer creators, as some of them fairly prominent in the space, about how it does sort of seem sometimes right now that we're often trapped in kind of a like queer 101 course. And that's a lot of the material that comes out. Themes
Mm,
sometimes like it is like it's almost made for allies to understand, or it's maybe made for, being more generous, or it's made for people who are more recently out. And that is important. There needs to be material like that. People need to feel welcomed.
mm.
There's a reason you have 101 courses. You do need those. but it feels like there's like a glut of that and there's not as much coming out. It's like because eventually you hope that you will be out longer than you were not out in your life. And you're still
Mhm.
going to want to consume media. And maybe you're pushing 40 like me and you've been out for over half your life. What you look for in queer media and representation is going to be different than someone who is questioning, who's recently come out, who's only been out for 5 years. And what Rachel, I think, was able to do with her Doom Patrol run is again, like create this like work that stands the test of time that both feels inviting, but it also doesn't, it never feels like you're being talked down to. It doesn't feel like it's being dumbed down for an audience. It's honestly like hanging out with someone like Rachel Pollack. You know, she was so welcoming and inviting, and she would, particularly, decades ago, answer people's, sort of questions that, might make you cringe now about things. I'll share this since Neil Gaiman brought this up in a
Mm.
conversation that I had with him at the Nation of Writers podcast. And he said this with all humility. He didn't even have to share this, but he's like in his 20s, and Rachel was like the first trans woman he met, and he asked her like, so if there's like trans women, does that mean there's trans men? And
Mhm.
it was one of those things. And I mean, that is something that I still see blow people's minds today, you know? But yeah, no, she was always very open and happy to have those conversations. I very distinctly remember having a conversation with her where I'm getting emotional just gearing up to say this. Because again, it's just one of those things that speaks to that like innocence and just thinking the best of people as her like gut reaction. We were talking and she was just like, I don't understand how someone could be out and trans and not like want to be like a member of the community and not want to be part of this beautiful thing, and it's like that kind of stuff. Like that's Rachel. And again, just this overwhelming positivity and wanting people to feel like welcomed and that there was a place for them and that there was, like literature for them and everything.
I love how much she just throws readers into these
Oh yeah.
queer communities. Yeah, Coagula has trans friends in a seemingly trans bar, though she doesn't
Hmm.
spell it out. And Godmother Night, the main characters are very involved with like a lesbian activism club, and like there's never a segment where they like break things down and explain any of these terms. Like it's just stated very matter of factly. Like this is, and you can tell it's someone pulling from their
Oh yeah.
lived experience at that. And so I think that does kind of skip what you were talking about with like the
Yeah.
101 or like the queer issues 101 aspect of a lot of modern media.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And another thing too, like with Godmother Night, Temporary Agency, Unquenchable Fire, these books, it feels like not only if these books came out now, would there have been notes to be like, you have to make this more explicit, or you have to do this, or you have to explain this. But like it feels like if Godmother Night came out now, they would be like, well, we have to have like two women holding hands or kissing or something on the like we have to make it clear this is
Mm.
a lesbian book. And I know I'm being a bit flippant and unfair saying that. I'm being a bit hyperbolic here, but it does feel like the work, the way Rachel lived her life, the way she would talk, like she was a writer, and that's what she wanted to be known for. She wanted to be known for being a writer, which included writing about tarot, writing prose, writing comics. And it was more of this idea of like, she wants to be known as a writer. She's a writer. And like, of course she's trans. And of course these things are in her writing. And it's like this like matter of fact, like I'm a writer. these are things I write about, and you'll figure it out. You'll have to come on board and get with it.
I think she does a good job putting people in this, putting them in a place where they can understand a lot of like the trans experience by not always explicitly talking about the characters' experiences as
Yeah.
trans ones. Like one of the focal characters of Godmother Night of Jake, like having this dilemma in the first chapter or two about like not feeling like their name
Yep.
fits them, and then coming across the name Jake. They never state that that character is transgender, and she really sticks to a pretty feminine role after that. But like they nail that feeling of dysphoria that like I've noticed that in a few of the shorts and other things I've picked up of like transcribing the feelings of dysphoria to other things without making it quite allegory, just like describing the feeling rather than naming the feeling and naming it as an experience specific to trans people.
Yeah, of course. And, I think that's important. I think it's good to see that sort of work out there. And I think there's a lot of people in queer spaces, trans or not, gender nonconforming, non-binary, queer, in all these different circles that, it's an important part of who you are. It's part of your identity, but there's also more to us than that. And I think it's important to embrace that and celebrate that and push that too. And Rachel did all of that. There was seemingly no part of Rachel's life that was uninteresting. Whether it was, her identity, her writing, her experience in tarot, her travels, her knowledge of religion, her knowledge of cultures, her just entirely esoteric knowledge that was just fascinating. But also visiting her in hospice, she was, we had Buffy the Vampire Slayer was on. When I visited her in rehab, she was talking about how she had been watching, the Sandman adaptation, was enjoying that. Like there's, she had so many interests, and there was just so much to her, and that's part of it. That's part of being queer is everything else about you, and there's just it's. I guess, I'd sort of say that like every aspect of her life was admirable and aspirational in some form or fashion. Like it's, she lived abroad. She traveled all over the world. She never got to Japan, and we had talked about that. How she had wished she could have gone to Japan, and things like that. But she was well traveled. She got to live all sorts of places. She got to meet all sorts of people, experience all sorts of things, and through that queer lens, and that's something I think people are able to do it. It's important too, is just experiencing all these different things through your unique queer lens.
And I guess having known her and getting to see all these different facets of her life, all these different interests of hers, and also getting to work alongside her professionally, like, how do you think your time with Rachel both has shaped and will continue to shape you as a writer and the way you write queer and specifically trans characters?
So for me, and this, it overlaps and ties into some of the stuff we've been talking about already. Reading Rachel's work and then meeting and understanding Rachel. At first, when you check this out with no context, you're like, how in the hell does anyone even come up with this? I mean, it's like, Godmother Night is like, in a lesbian, like R-rated Miyazaki nightmare, and like just things like that, where you're like, oh my, like where is this coming from? Where do you even think this? And then you talk to her and you see her inspiration, and she's like, oh well, this is from this culture. I traveled here and I read this author and I was listening to this music, or I saw this play, or like all these things. And there's these inspirations and these different folk tales and legends and Greek mythology, and And that's when I got the realization of like, these stories are so fantastical and imaginative and raw and human. And I think that's another thing to stress too, is how human Rachel's writing is. Like everyone, like there's I'm trying to think of the exact line, but like in Godmother Night, where like, you know, like someone was like reading like a newspaper, and one of the characters just wanted to be like, I just want to like grab it and like shove it in their face. Like that kind of like these sort of like passive thoughts of heightened emotions and like things like
Hmm.
that got like worked into her work. Like it's just so human, and it's so inspired by just being alive and experiencing the world. And that's when I was like, oh, I can do that. It's not going to be Rachel's experience, but I can experience things and use that with my lived in experience of just, again, just being alive and experiencing a range of emotions throughout the day from the different activities I do. And it's not going to be Rachel's, but it's going to be mine. And I can do something like that, or there's a path to get there. And that's the same for everyone listening too. It's like, if you're an aspiring creator, it's like you can do that. And it's not going to be Rachel's, but it's going to be yours. And it's going to be your version of what she did. And part of that came from Rachel's needless humility. It never, like, talking to Rachel, and again, like, if people had her as teacher or a professor, if people like anything, it's she never felt like she never put herself above other people. She never made it feel like, I have this knowledge and you have to come to me and I will like let you get piece by piece over time. It's like, no, she was very open. She was down to earth. She was human in that respect. And that accessibility, that openness about writing and her stories, and just her willingness to talk to people about so many things, that I think allowed me and other people that knew her to be like, I can do this, but it's going to be mine. So
Beautiful.
thank you.
Do want to steer our conversation toward eventually our question of the week, but I wanted to talk about one of the shared loves of both you and Rachel
Sure.
that you've mentioned elsewhere, but that being the works of Philip K. Dick.
Yes.
And specifically A Scanner Darkly. And I'd really like to know, like, so he's a bit of a blind spot in my sci-fi knowledge, but I think
Sure.
he's an incredibly fascinating figure.
Mhm.
But like, where would you say you see his influence within Rachel's writing?
Well, in particular with something like A Scanner Darkly, which is both her and I's favorite Philip K. Dick novel, which I found out when I was reading it, and I was on the phone with her. I mentioned it, and she was like, "Oh, that's my favorite, like Philip K. Dick novel." And she had mentioned that she was like, it's a difficult read, like emotionally. So she was like, I couldn't read it again, so I had
Mm,
to listen to the audiobook.
mm,
to experience it again, which she did get to do. But I mean, a quick sort of way to sum up A Scanner Darkly for some people that don't know, and it'll immediately click, and everyone will be like, "Oh, duh." Is you could kind of boil that book down to a bunch of people just wanted to have a good time and they were punished for it.
mm.
So you can see a lot of that in her work, as well as my work. It's certainly very clear, I think, in The Neverending Party, that
Yeah.
idea is prevalent. So
And how do you feel about the film adaptation of A Scanner Darkly?
I liked it enough. I think the book was better. I have been meaning to rewatch it. Close person in my life, Chase.
Mm.
We've been talking about watching it for like months, so that might be coming up rather quickly. We still also have to, because he's never seen Superman the movie from 1978, so we're gonna have to do that soon too. But yeah, Scanner Darkly, just I it's a gorgeous looking movie, I think, at least at the
Mm. Oh,
time.
yeah.
But yeah, it's such a, like, God, the way the book ends, it's just it's a really brutal book. Don't try. if you're about to finish the book, like try to do it like at the end of your day. Don't like start your day being like, I got one more, got a few more chapters in a Scared of Darkly I want to bang out before I start my day. Like, don't do that. But yeah, and I recently reread the Minority Report short story too, which is excellent. If your only experience was the movie of that, the short story is wildly different. Like the movie is kind of a very basic idea, but like the short story has like two or three more twists than sort of the movie,
Okay.
and also doubles down on sort of this like a more negative nature. I think it's also fascinating too that I would think it's fair to say that a lot of Philip K. Dick's work is at least somewhat cynical,
Mhm.
whereas Rachel's a very sort of like optimistic person, which I think at my core, like I love cynicism, but sort of at my core, I'm an optimist, but please don't tell anybody. Uh, which I think was also part of how, Rachel and I just gelled well.
Mhm. And just since you mentioned the visual style of A Scanner Darkly, I'm curious, have you seen Waking Life from Richard Linklater as well?
I haven't seen that one, but the cover to the DVD is burned into my mind because I worked at a Hollywood Video.
Ah,
So I can picture it, but you're gonna make me do this like Richard Linklater double feature soon. It's gonna happen.
yeah, like my girlfriend's been showing me some Richard Linklater stuff this last
Okay.
year, and yeah, Waking Life is now one of my favorite movies. Like, Midnight Gospel is one of my all-time favorite shows,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
there's I've always been sad that I've not been able to find anything else anywhere close to that thing. Like, there's
Yeah.
just not other media like it, but Waking Life is like the one other thing that I can actually point to and be like, yes, this scratches that exact same itch, but in a bit more streamlined way. There's some stuff that all Philip K. Dick fans will love that's in there, but I won't spoil that. But I think it's going to be a real treat for you and Chase if you chase a
Yeah.
Scanner Darkly with Waking Life.
I'm sure we will. Oh God. The last movie I saw in theaters was Robot Dreams, which is based on a graphic novel. Have you seen that?
No.
It's a gorgeous animated movie that's like I think it was a co-production with Spain and France. And it's like there's almost no dialogue in it. But it's also a very queer movie because it's basically like they're all anthro people, and this like male dog is looking for like a partner and ends up getting a robot to build to be his partner. And the
Mm.
robot is very male coded. And it's like it's it's a trip for people. Like people should seek that movie out. It is
Okay.
gorgeous, it's cute, it's queer, it's a fun time.
So the question of the week that I like to tie into my guest personal interests, wrapping back to Philip K. Dick novels,
Mhm.
what novel of his do you think is most in need of an adaptation or most in need of a better adaptation based on things we've discussed so far?
You know, Minority Report is actually definitely up there. I rewatched it recently and oof, it is I think especially now, I think that movie ages rather poorly because there's this like core to the movie that's like the I don't know, it gets a little muddied with like government bureaucracy and the cops and kind of like that there are actually people within an authoritarian regime that
Mm.
would do the right thing. Like these kind of things that just it's like
Mm.
this doesn't make any sense. The short story is much more cynical, and the
Mm.
short story, the way that's done, is more like we know there are flaws in this system, but the system is too important. So we would rather other people suffer for the sake of supporting this system that we think is necessary.
Mm.
That resonates. And here's the thing, that is an evergreen story because that is just true throughout history.
Mm.
I want to see the Minority Report adaptation that does that rather than like, don't worry, folks. people that work within an authoritarian regime, there are some good eggs in there and they're watching out for you and it's going to be okay in the end. Oh, God, it's frustrating.
Yeah, just like a month ago, my girlfriend and I rewatched Total Recall, the original one, of course.
Yeah.
And it's weird watching that one now. Like, I know people talk about how you can really lean toward the movie all being a dream, but
Yeah.
the way that just by virtue of being an 80s action movie, it's like everything that's weird about 80s action movies makes this feel more like a dream now, but I don't know if that was intended at the time. That's just how movies were, especially Paul Verhoeven's
Yeah.
movies were. But yeah, like I don't need another Total Recall remake, but I think I would love to see a more direct adaptation of We Can Remember It for You Wholesale. Just
Yeah,
to
I'm
see a
with
more
you.
true version of that.
I would also love to see Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and just call it that and do it closer to the book. Blade Runner is one of my favorite movies, but
Mm.
like those like emotion boxes and things like that in the book. And there's none of this like young love interest thing. Like Deckard's already like married and he has this like kind of tired relationship with his wife and stuff like that. I want to see that. I think it's actually, I know there are people who have read the book who prefer the movie, and I get it. I love the movie, but I also love the book, and I would like to see that adapted. But the one to me that's just the more pressing is Minority Report,
Mm.
because that's just such a horrible lesson at the end of that movie. And I watched it again weeks ago, and I'm still like, how could they do that? Like,
Mm. Now, Joe, you've been so incredible in sharing so much about Rachel, and like I feel like I have a much better feel for what she was like in person. But I do want to make sure you have a moment to talk about all the exciting things you're working on at the moment. So, yeah, can you tell our listeners a little bit about what they can expect from you in the near future or recent projects they should be on the lookout for?
Sure. I do think the most important thing for me to plug here is the DC Pride Celebration of Rachel Pollack, which is available now. I would love for that to completely sell out. So if we could, make that happen, maybe we could get, a reprint of her New Gods run or something. Like if we can
Mm.
show that there's, interest in that. I also want to see her Tomahawk get reprinted, that Vertigo Visions one shot. That would be great. You can still get the trade through Comixology through Dark Horse of the Neverending Party, still available. So, please, I definitely want more people to check that out.
Didn't you have a hand in getting the trade of Timebreakers remade or
Yeah,
re-released?
a little bit. I've been trying to get that done for years, and I've been working
Mm.
with Chris and Rachel on trying to find a place. We almost got it at Dover Publications, but that didn't end up going anywhere. There was another publisher that came close, but it didn't happen. And then it was unfortunately after Rachel hadn't passed at the time, but got in touch with Jordan at Zoop, and then that was able to happen.
Mm.
And, I do love Timebreakers as well. That was through the Helix imprint, so it was technically creator owned, but through a DC imprint, the rights reverted back to Rachel and Chris. And Chris is phenomenal. And again, that's sort of like tying into Grant Morrison, Chris Weston, other than doing a ton of stuff, doing some Judge Dredd. I love Judge Dredd.
Mm.
It's so great. But he did The Filth with Grant Morrison.
Mm.
So, if people haven't checked that out, that's also like, if you like Grant, you haven't read The Filth, like it's a very Grant book. And Chris Wesson is just an incredible artist. But yes, I believe you could probably still order copies of Timebreakers through that Soup campaign. It's close. I think it finished, but keep an eye out on that. I had all the issues and I have all my issues signed by Rachel,
Aw.
but definitely keep an eye out for that. And then I have my first YA graphic novel came out in April, King Arthur and the Knights of Justice, which you mentioned. What was it? There is, gay couple in that. We made Lance and Breeze gay. And they're in a relationship together, and it's cute. It's not like, and again, in a very like, in my effort to sort of like avoid like 101 stuff, it's very matter of fact. It's just there. We don't have characters who are like, but how could they be? There's it's just that's just part of the story, and you just deal with it. And then I have that, and then the next thing I have out is Kardak the Mystic, which is a one-shot through Archie that is out August 14th. So there's a chance this is going to be out before Final Order cutoff. So you might even be able to like reach out to your local comic shop. And that is a revival of a Golden Age character, which is like something I love. And it rides that line of Archie superhero and Archie horror. So I think if you like stuff like the Archie horror stuff, if you also like stuff like that, like Jaguar, one shot recently, I think you'll like this. I've seen all of the interiors inked now, and Butch Mappa's art honestly completely blows me away. I can't believe this book is going to look this good. So I hope people check that out as well.
Very cool. And small curiosity, I just saw today that Princess Guinevere and the Jewel Riders is also getting a graphic novel from Mad Cave. And I know those cartoons shared some like creative DNA. Yeah. And just interesting, those are both getting comics this year. Did you have any hand in that coming to life, or was that completely separate team?
It's a separate creative team. I believe Jordi Belair is the writer on that one, but my editor Lauren on King Arthur, like she edited that as well. It's the same, same license holder. So like,
okay,
but yeah, I had part of how I ended up working on this is I was asking at like Baltimore 2022. About like I had wrapped up Dahlia in the Dark at that point, so I'd already done a couple of things at Mad Cave, and was like, oh, if there's anything else like coming up, I'd love to throw my hat in the ring. And they were like, oh, do you know like like just like, oh, out of curiosity, like Princess Guinevere and the Jewel Riders? And I was like, I mean, like I didn't watch that as a kid, but I did watch King Arthur and the Knights of Justice, and it was like, oh, okay. So and then like later on, like reached out being like, oh, so you didn't know that, like, we have this, do you want to work on it? And it worked out that way. But I also reached out to people at Mad Cave too, was just like, I know I didn't work on it, but can you send me a copy of Princess Guinevere and the Jewel Riders, because I really want to read it. So
yeah, that's close enough to Tokusatsu and Transforming Heroes. I might see about getting her on Giant-Sized Violence just for that, because like it caught my eye.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. No, and it's a gorgeous book. People should definitely check that out for sure.
All right, now Joe, our listeners want to keep tabs on you in the future to follow your other projects. Where can they find you online?
You can find me on Twitter for as long as this site's still there. Who knows? It might not be there by the time this episode goes up. And Blue Sky at Joe Corallo, so JoeCorallo, and on Instagram at Corallo Joe.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Joe, for coming on and sharing so much. This was really excellent. Like, yeah, you knocked it out of the park as far as bringing me up to speed on what Rachel was like and like just her creative influences. This was incredible.
Thank you. I'm glad. Really, I appreciate it.
If the listeners at home have requests or recommendations for comics or creators you'd like us to cover in the future, you can send them our way on social media. You can find us on the Transcending Comics Instagram and Facebook page, on Twitter is @TranscendComics, or email us at transcendingcomics@gmail.com. I'd like to thank you again for giving our podcast a chance, and give a shout out to Ray Day Parade for designing our logo. Join us again next time as we continue transcending boundaries and exploring the colorful world of trans, non-binary, and genderqueer representation in comic books of all kinds. As the curtains fall on this episode of Transcending Comics, remember that comics have the power to inspire change in countless worlds, including our own. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep transcending.